This video is probably not going to make a lot of people happy, but I thought it was important to make it anyway. Story in Pokemon games is like those free movies you get on an airplane. A nice bonus, but if they're not there, a lot of people are not going to complain. However, I love those free movies, and I love story in my Pokemon games. It doesn't have to be a complicated story. I'm not asking Pokemon to have stories as nuanced and thematically dense as Xenoblade Chronicles or the Final Fantasy series. I don't know if I'd even like that. The focus in Pokemon games is and always should be on exploration. It should be on catching Pokemon. It should be exploring this new world. And on all those fronts, Pokemon Sword and Shield is, at worst, adequate, and at best, pretty dang great. Series newcomers are going to love this game, as are longtime fans as soon as they get past their disdain at the national dex not being included. It's not open world in the strictest sense of the term, but it provides a more open world than in previous Pokemon games. And I will admit that it feels fantastic to finally have a console Pokemon game, something I have wanted ever since I was a kid. But I do want some story. Pokemon games have the potential to deliver stories with sincerity and power. Think of N's wanderings in Black and White, or Lily trying to overcome the psychological trauma her mother inflicted upon her in Sun and Moon. As I'm releasing this video on the game's release date, I'll try to avoid anything that could possibly be considered a spoiler. But allow me to say there is nothing quite that powerful and poignant in Sword and Shield. And that is a shame. If I had to boil Pokemon games down to one word, just one word, that word would be adventure. And by adventure I don't mean quest or journey, like in Zelda. I mean adventure in the purest sense of the term. Exploring the world may be part of your adventure, but so is forming bonds with people you care about. So is expanding your view of the world. So is taking a moment from your battles and your catching to consider the workings of that world. That is why Pokemon games need stories. And that is why Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon were so disappointing in the end. The original Sun and Moon may be about Alola and the Island Challenge and the Ultra Beasts, but more than that, they are about Lily. And they're about her relationship to the player. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon completely gutted the character and gutted that relationship. Pokemon games are always charming viscerally, but I want something to remember them by after I've finished playing, and normally that's the story. That the story of Sword and Shield was not prioritized in the trailers was not an oversight. It's because there's not much of a story here beyond what you'd expect from an average Pokemon game. While the games are not completely free of great characters, and there are a few moments I'd place in the pantheon of great Pokemon moments, there are no characters whose stories cut as deeply as Lily's or N's. Pokemon has this weird cycle where it switches between being more story-focused and more spectacle-focused between generations. Think about it. Generation 5, the second generation on the Nintendo DS, was more story-focused than Generation 4. Then came Generation 6, the first generation on the 3Ds. Those games brought innovations in terms of graphics and gameplay, bringing the series into 3 full dimensions. After that, there was Generation 7, the second generation on the 3Ds, which was substantially more story-focused, at least until Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. And here we are at Generation 8, the first generation on the highly successful, and rightfully successful, Nintendo Switch, and again the focus is more on presentation. This makes sense if you think about it. For as much as people complain about how much the franchise recycles between games, bringing a franchise onto a new platform is hard, especially when it's a franchise with as many moving pieces as the Pokemon franchise. You have almost 1,000 creatures and all the stress associated with that. Now, would it be possible for a generation to be a massive upgrade both in terms of presentation and in terms of story? Yes, of course, but that would take time. Breath of the Wild is as good as it is because they took time to develop it. They kept pushing it back, they kept delaying it, they kept moving things around and trying to get it just right. It came out a full 6 years after Skyward Sword. Pokemon games, however, are produced quickly. Aside from 2015, there has been a mainline Pokemon game every year since 2012. That's crazy. If you know anything about the time and effort it takes to develop a game this size, even with a massive team, your mind is probably boggled at how Pokemon manages to do this. If the franchise decided to take a couple years off to really refine and perfect the art being made, they could indeed maximize story and presentation. But of course they're not going to do that because that would deprive them of the opportunity to make money. Pokemon is a cash cow and they are not going to stop milking it. Honestly, what Sword and Shield remind me most vividly of are Pokemon X and Pokemon Y. Now, I like those games a lot. I've probably put more time into them than I have into any Pokemon games, just because they were released in a time when I had a lot of time to play Pokemon. But I never enjoyed the game's villains, Team Flare. They're a major step backward from Team Plasma, and even compared to Team Aqua and Team Magma from Generation 3, they are seriously lacking. Those Gen 3 villains may have motives as simple as make more land and make more water, but they have personality, they have presence, there's some sort of substance to them. As silly as they aren't jokes. Team Flare is. Now, as heartfelt as the story of AZ and the war and his Flabébé are, all that always seems like background dressing. It never seems integral to the story the game is telling. It never seems nearly as personal and connected to everything as N or Lily's story does. When I think of Gen 5, I think of N. When I think of Gen 7, I think of Lily. But when I think of Gen 6, I don't think of AZ. In fact, while researching this video, it took me a while to even remember that he existed. And I certainly don't think of Lysander, X and Y's yawn-inducing villain. I don't think of any character at all, really. You, the player, have so many friendly rivals that none of them make an impression. No, when I think of Generation 6, I think of style. I think of flash. These are the games that take place in Kalos, an obvious France analog, and to their credit, the games do try hard to capture the spirit of France. There's an emphasis on art and aesthetics. It's not a coincidence that this is the region that introduced trainer customization. Sure, it's an overly romanticized version of France, but number one, this is Pokémon, so what else do you expect? And number two, it's not actually all that much more romanticized than the versions of Paris and France that float through a lot of people's heads. I like Kalos. It's not my favorite region, I wouldn't put it above Hoenn or Sinnoh, but I like it better than a lot of regions. Similarly, I love the Galar region of Sword and Shield. Sure, it's just the United Kingdom turned upside down, but do you really need more than that? There's nothing wrong with making your reference points obvious. It's such a sincere evocation of Britain. There's enough love for the rolling countryside to make Tolkien proud, but there's also a warm-hearted attempt to analyze the impacts of industrialized Britain. The story of Britain is in part that of the conflict between a beautiful, if overly idealized, past and a messy industrial present, and Pokemon Sword and Shield understand that. But the game's love of England is not restricted to large-scale thematic things. It's also in the tiny details. How certain things look and how certain people talk. A lot of English YouTubers have said that the games really reflect their country, and I can definitely see that. It is a smart and adept portrayal. Like X and Y, Sword and Shield are best viewed as 20-plus hours of undiluted spectacle. It's an easy game to pick up and it's a hard game to put down. I'm sure that's exactly what Nintendo wanted. Not everything works, to be sure. If you thought the Dynamax mechanic looked gimmicky when they showed it off in trailers, I doubt the actual gameplay experience will change your mind. But it's hard to come away from the experience thinking that Nintendo and Game Freak are desecrating their beloved franchise, even if you're one of those hardcore pro-National Dex people. If you are at all interested in Pokemon, you will have a good time with this game. but the story fails to leave an impression. The villains are not as interesting as they could be. Team Yell is a bit more complex than they appear to be at first, but they do not compare to Team Plasma or the Aether Foundation. Your rival once again fails to impress. There are a few neat twists, but none of them are as interesting or as incisive as they could have been. The legendary Pokemon aren't particularly impressive either, and that's one thing that X and Y did right. Xerneas and Yveltal are ancient, haunting, beautiful creatures. The legendaries of Sword and Shield, however, don't evoke anything more than a baffled shrug from me. I was constantly left wanting more. Now, don't get me wrong, these games should be celebrated for what they are. I don't mean to sound like the stereotypical old man lecturing his grandson about how he used to walk 5 miles in the snow to school every day, but if you're a younger viewer, I do hope you appreciate just how special it is to be getting a Pokemon game on a mainline Nintendo console. This is something I've waited for pretty much my entire life. But I wanted this game to be as much a step forward for its franchise as Breath of the Wild was for the Legend of Zelda franchise. And, well, it's just not. It's just another great game in a franchise with a long and proud history of producing a lot of great games. The story is adequate, the characters are adequate, but they're underwhelming. Seeing the scope of this world and the amount of detail that was clearly invested into certain aspects of the game, I can't help but wonder what would have been the result if that amount of time and effort had been dedicated to the narrative. While the story gripped me on several occasions, the most emotional parts of the game for me were gameplay related. They came when I won a close battle, or when I encountered a rare Pokemon, or when I took a break from my exploring to just admire the vast world of this game. They were enough to make me glad I was playing this game, but compare it to something like Breath of the Wild. Now, Breath of the Wild is not acclaimed for its overarching plot, but story elements are integrated into the gameplay, just like Mad Max Fury Road advances narrative through action beats. Breath of the Wild advances narrative through gameplay. Everything from the sparse musical arrangements to the empty, desolate world create the feeling that something has been lost, that Hyrule has been defeated, and that the world needs to be redeemed, and that no one but us can do it. Pokemon Sword and Shield do not accomplish such an august feat. The gameplay is a little more engaging than in previous Pokemon games, but it's not a radically different experience, and the story is a little less interesting than that of most recent Pokemon games. If that doesn't sound like a problem to you, it won't be, and you'll love these games. Good for you. I wish I felt as you do, but I must be honest with myself, and my honest opinion is that I don't think these games will be as fondly remembered as the best entries in this franchise. When we get Pokemon games with better graphics than this, packaged with a more layered and dynamic story, I think these games will be forgotten. I don't know how many Pokemon fans are going to say this is their favorite game. I'm glad Sword and Shield exist, but they are not life-changing, and a major reason for that is how flat they are from a narrative standpoint. It's not that I hate the story of this game, it's that I just don't really care about it. So thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. I've done over a half dozen Pokemon videos in the past, so if you liked this one, I recommend looking at those. Now, if you are a big fan of Pokemon Sword and Shield, again, I hope you're happy, but we have to consider as a community, as a fandom, what we really want from the series in terms of a storytelling perspective. It's a question we can't just sweep under the rug. Anyhow, thank you again. Tune in soon for the next analysis on this channel. It'll be coming in about a week or so. Adios, comrades.